On the island of Oahu, the early summer nights of 1942 were hot and suffocating. Outside, the Pacific wind blew across the shores of Pearl Harbor, carrying the scent of engine oil, sea salt, and scorched steel from the ships being patched up after the Pearl Harbor nightmare. But deep underground, in the old basement of the Naval Administrative Building, there was another world. There, instead of the sound of bombs, came the monotonous rhythm of IBM machines tapping like the heartbeat of a tense nation. The room was cramped, no bigger than a classroom, with a low ceiling and damp walls. No windows, no natural light. Only heat from the punch card machines and the acrid smell of old electrical wires. Amid stacks of paper, towering like fortress walls, a gaunt man hunched over his desk, dark circles under his eyes, disheveled hair, wrinkled shirt. That was Joseph Rochefort, a U.S. Navy lieutenant commander, the man who would help turn the tide of the war for America, only to be forgotten for the next 4 decades. His hand trembled slightly from exhaustion. On his desk lay endless rows of meaningless number groups: 28491, 55602, 73390, each string a fragment of the enigma known as JN-25. The Imperial Japanese Navy's supreme code. Every error, every miscalculation could cost thousands of lives in the Pacific. In that bunker, Rochefort and his team didn't carry guns, but they too were at war, with their minds. The narrator seems to pause, then lowers their voice. Sometimes war isn't decided on the battlefield, but in a windowless room. After the disaster of December 7th, 1941, America collapsed in agony. 2,403 dead, 8 battleships sunk or damaged, over 180 aircraft destroyed. The entire nation was stunned. But amid the smoke and fire, the men in the station hypo basement understood. If they couldn't read the enemy's signals, America would lose even more. They weren't hardened warriors. They were eccentrics, engineers, linguists, mathematicians, radio men. Some worked in bathrobes, some chain-smoked, some hadn't left the bunker in weeks. On Rochefort's desk was a small, handwritten sign. You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. The tone of the story grows warm and slow, like an old host recounting to a new generation. These men, forced into the shadows, worked with passion and desperation. No titles, no glory, only duty, and the belief that understanding the enemy meant saving comrades. On the table, hundreds of IBM punch cards were stacked high. Each card was the result of hours of analysis. Each number held a word, a phrase, an order from the Japanese Empire, all encoded in a system of over 33,000 5-digit groups, layered with random additive numbers to confuse standard calculations. A maze of math and language. Rochefort knew, if they couldn't break JN-25, the U.S. Navy would be blind in its own war. In those days, they had no computers, no software, no artificial intelligence, only aging punch card machines and exhausted minds. Beside Rochefort was Thomas Dyer, his closest comrade. A younger man, dark-haired, bespectacled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He had an extraordinary memory, recalling hundreds of number combinations as if they were melodies. Sometimes Dyer would pause, close his eyes, and say, "I think this group showed up in the February message." And he'd be right. In the corner of the room, Alva Laswell, the language specialist, meticulously compared Japanese phrases with thousands of symbol chains, trying to guess what AF, a mysterious term repeated in transmissions, might refer to. Nearby, electric fans sluggishly pushed the heat from the IBM machines in slow circles, only to have it fall back down again. Their days didn't follow the clock. They dozed at their desks, ate cold sandwiches, then jumped up again when the teleprinter spat out a new line. Above them, Navy admirals waited for one answer. Where will Japan strike next? And in that bunker, Rochefort knew that even a single line of error could mean the death of thousands. He wasn't fond of arguing, but he was stubborn to the core. When superiors in Washington demanded adherence to protocol and to wait for official confirmation, he replied bluntly, "Procedure can't win a war." To Rochefort, time was the real enemy. An enemy he couldn't shoot, only outwit with reason. His story didn't begin with the sound of gunfire, but with the sound of intellect fighting despair. The thudding of IBM machines, the rustle of turning paper, the sighs of the sleepless. And in the middle of it all, Rochefort's gaze. Weary but never straying from the lifeless number sequences. Because he knew, hidden in those numbers was the fate of the entire Pacific. On the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Hawaii awoke to a gentle sunrise. On the island of Oahu, American families were getting ready for church. The chapel bells blended with the sound of waves crashing on the shore, peaceful like any other day. At Pearl Harbor, sailors aboard battleships were having breakfast, or still sleeping off a long night. No one knew that, within minutes, America's peace would be torn apart. At 7:55 a.m., the northern sky suddenly roared. 353 Japanese aircraft descended in 2 waves, launched from 6 aircraft carriers under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The sun was blotted out by wings of steel, and in a few brief seconds, the peace of the 20th century died. Alarm sirens blared across the harbor. Bombs exploded, bullets screamed, people shouted, and metal shattered. The USS Arizona was hit first. An armor-piercing 800-pound bomb plunged through the deck and detonated the forward ammunition magazine. In a flash, the massive ship was lifted out of the water and exploded. 1,177 sailors, unable to escape, vanished in a fireball of flames and thick oil smoke. That day, the Arizona became a mass grave, the final resting place of men who would never return. Not far away, the USS Oklahoma was struck by torpedoes, rolled over, and capsized. 429 men were trapped in darkness. Some survived in air pockets for 2 days, pounding desperately on the hull in hopes of rescue. That sound became the ticking of despair, until it faded away. The USS West Virginia sank slowly to the harbor floor. 106 men missing. The ships California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were all hit by bombs and torpedoes. Above the water, thick black smoke rose hundreds of feet, the sun disappeared, and Hawaii's sky turned blood red. In just 2 hours, America lost 8 battleships, over 180 aircraft, and 2,403 lives, including 68 civilians. It was the most devastating blow in American military history. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood frozen as he watched the base engulfed in smoke. When a stray bullet shattered the glass of his office window, he bent down, picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, and quietly said to his aide, "Perhaps it would have been better if this bullet had ended me." He knew his career was over, and that America had just entered a war from which there was no return. Yet amid the inferno, something strange happened. 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all absent that morning. One was delivering aircraft to Wake Island, one was training offshore, and one was in dry dock on the West Coast. Due to weather delays and schedule shifts, all 3 escaped the attack. No one knew then that these very ships would become the backbone of America's counteroffensive. The Japanese attack was flawlessly planned. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and understood America well, aimed to crush American morale within the first 6 months. He believed that if the Pacific Fleet was destroyed, Japan could expand from the Philippines to Indonesia, then force Washington to negotiate peace. But Yamamoto also once said a prophetic line, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." And he was right. Inside Station Hypo, where Rochefort and his team worked, the bombs above echoed downward. The entire basement shook, dust fell from the ceiling, but no one left their desk. They didn't know exactly what was happening, only heard sirens and the roar of engines outside. When the official message came through, "Pearl Harbor has been attacked," Rochefort simply stood up, took off his glasses, and said one sentence, "So, it's war for real." In the days that followed, America mourned. Newspapers were filled with images of burned ships and bodies pulled from the bay. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8, 1941. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The entire nation rose up. People lined up outside enlistment stations. Workers, farmers, students, engineers all became part of the arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised. Factories roared to life through the night. Old ships were hauled in for repairs, and America began turning grief into strength. Meanwhile, in the basement of Station Hypo, Joseph Rochefort received a new mission: to read the enemy's mind. To him, it wasn't just a job. It was a debt to those who perished in the smoke of Pearl Harbor. If he could understand the language of the Japanese Empire, if he could know their moves in advance, the tragedy would never repeat. The man didn't know then that 6 months later, he would be the one to help the United States win the greatest naval battle in modern history, but also the one who would pay for it with his entire career. After the Pearl Harbor disaster, America was stunned, but not defeated. While smoke still rose from the wreck of the Arizona, the sound of hammers rang through repair yards along the bay. Thousands of mechanics, engineers, and workers labored day and night to salvage anything still usable. But deep underground, where sunlight never reached, another kind of reconstruction had begun. A reconstruction of the mind. That bunker, beneath the old administrative building at Pearl Harbor, was codenamed Station Hypo, the H standing for Hawaii in the phonetic radio alphabet. Officially, it was just the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, tasked with intercepting and decoding enemy radio transmissions. But in reality, it was the silent heart of American intelligence, where numbers, symbols, and telegrams became weapons. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rochefort, was unlike any other officer. Born in 1900 in Dayton, Ohio, he had sharp eyes, a lean frame, and a calm demeanor. He studied at the Stevens Institute of Technology, became an engineer, and later transitioned into cryptography. Unlike many commanding officers who favored orders and ceremony, Rochefort believed that victory began with intellect and collaboration. He had a simple motto: "We can accomplish anything, as long as no one cares who gets the credit." It was a philosophy rare in the military, but it became the soul of Station Hypo. In a room barely larger than a classroom, Rochefort assembled one of the strangest teams the Navy had ever seen. They weren't heroes, didn't carry guns, but each one possessed a brilliant mind. Thomas Dyer, his loyal assistant, had a phenomenal memory and the logic of a living computer. Alva Laswell, a Marine officer who had studied Japanese in Tokyo, deeply understood the enemy's language and culture. Wilfred Holmes, a former submarine officer, practical, battle-tested, and soon to devise the famous water shortage ruse that would change the course at Midway. Joseph Finnegan, a young analyst so obsessed with numbers he often forgot to eat or sleep, and who would later uncover how the Japanese encoded time and dates. All of them worked in one space, cramped, stifling, with walls shaking from the IBM machines. No ranks, no ceremonies, no pressed uniforms. People remembered Rochefort most by his gray bathrobe and slippers, symbols of practicality. In the unbearable heat and ozone stench of punch card machines, he chose comfort over formality. Superiors in Washington saw it as disrespect for military discipline. But those who worked with him knew, in hypo, results were all that mattered. When they stepped into that bunker, everyone understood they faced a nearly impossible mission: to break the JN-25 code system, the Japanese Navy's communications lifeline, which concealed everything from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. JN-25 was a mathematical beast. It consisted of 33,000 five-digit number groups, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. After being encoded via a codebook, the Japanese added random numbers from additive tables to mask the base code, creating a language nearly unreadable. Whenever they changed the codebook or additive tables, all prior analysis became worthless, and they changed them frequently. To decode a single JN-25 message, cryptanalysts had to peel away two layers: the additive layer, which had to be reverse subtracted to retrieve the original code; the codebook layer, where each five-digit group had to be matched to its meaning in Japanese. It was a job that required math, linguistics, and sheer human intuition. And in the first few months, they faced almost nothing but failure. Messages intercepted from stations in Hawaii, Australia, and Alaska. Thousands of lines of meaningless numbers. Rochefort hung a giant map of the Pacific on the wall, marking every frequency, every enemy call sign, hoping to find patterns in the chaos. When others lost hope, he simply said, "If they think their code is perfect, then they've already lost by thinking that." By day, the team pored over papers, IBM machines, and pencils. By night, they kept going, sometimes collapsing asleep at their desks. One man later recalled, "We only knew that there was a war out there, but our war was in here, in the numbers." When exhausted, Rochefort would turn on the radio and let soft jazz play. That sound became the only breath of life in a world of metal and formulas. Once, he joked, "If we crack JN-25, I'll treat everyone to dinner at the Moana Hotel." No one laughed. They knew he meant it, just not when that day would come. Outside, the war spread. The Philippines fell, Singapore was lost, the USS Lexington was sunk. In Washington, Navy officials were losing faith in the effort to break the Japanese code. But in Rochefort's basement in Hawaii, the lights never went out. He believed every number had a soul, and if he could find its pattern, he would understand the enemy's language. In March 1942, after nearly half a year of relentless work, a miracle occurred. Number patterns began to repeat. The sequences 284915602733390 appeared in multiple messages in similar contexts. Dyer discovered that some strings meant aircraft carrier, fuel, aircraft. The first door had opened. In the world of cryptography, it was like seeing the first light after a storm. From a few scattered pieces, they began to piece together a picture of the enemy's plans. And from those clues, they soon realized Japan was preparing the largest naval operation since Pearl Harbor. The target was codenamed with two letters, AF. But what was AF? Hawaii? The Aleutians? Port Moresby? Somewhere else? No one knew. and America couldn't afford to guess wrong. Joseph Rochefort understood. If he couldn't find the answer, everything they had done would be for nothing. So in that sweltering bunker, the race against time began again. A race between human intellect and Japan's vast war machine. In the world of intelligence, there are battles fought without a single shot. And in the Pacific of 1942, one of the quietest battles was unfolding. A war waged with numbers. The Japanese believed they had the most secure code system in the world. They called it Kaigun Ango. The Americans named it JN-25. Every message was composed of 5-digit groups, over 33,000 combinations in total. Each group represented a word, a phrase, or a concept in Japanese naval language. But what made it nearly unbreakable was a second layer. Random additive numbers drawn from hundreds of subtables, each containing 100 rows of random numbers, and each table changed regularly. When encoding, the sender would take each 5-digit group from the codebook and add a matching 5-digit number, without carrying over, to create the final result. For example, if the base code was 12345 and the additive was 56789, the result would be 68024. The receiver would simply subtract the additive, using the same rule, to recover the original code. To outsiders, it was just a sea of meaningless numbers. In 1941, just days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese changed the entire system again, switching to a new version called JN-25B. Everything the U.S. Navy had learned became useless. Every codebook, lookup table, and assumption had to be rebuilt from scratch. In the basement of Station Hypo, Rochefort sat silently for hours, staring at pages filled with numbers. He knew that to read JN-25, they had to find two things. 1. The additive table the Japanese had used. 2. The real meaning of each code group after peeling off that additive layer. This was no longer a machine's job. It was a job for human intuition. They began by observing repetitions. Some code groups repeatedly appeared in messages from carrier units, often alongside the same companions. Dyer noticed that if certain sequences always showed up together, they might mean ship, aircraft, or refueling. Laswell, fluent in Japanese, compared sentence structures, guessing that groups appearing at the end likely corresponded to particles or sentence endings in Japanese grammar. Finnegan, the youngest of the team, patiently ran IBM punch cards through the machines, thousands of them, searching for recurring additive patterns. IBM, the icon of American industry, became their silent ally. Massive electromechanical machines, hundreds of pounds heavy, pulsing with a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Rochefort often said, "The Japanese have a fleet. We have these machines, and the human mind." Every day, hundreds of messages were intercepted by listening stations spread across the Pacific. Hawaii, Australia, Midway. All were sent to Station Hypo. Meters-long scrolls filled with number groups like 90327, 44182, 77106. Most were unreadable. But sometimes, a single recurring sequence was enough to crack open a door. One evening in February 1942, Dyer shouted across the room, "Look at this! Group 77106 appears in every message containing Kido Butai, the carrier fleet." The room fell silent. For the first time, they had a meaningful piece of the puzzle. From there, piece by piece, the curtain began to lift. Each deciphered code group revealed a fragment of the enemy's plan. One group was identified as fuel reserves, another as warship, then air squadron, landing operation. The work was slow, grueling, but every breakthrough carried the weight of hope. By March, they decoded a longer sequence, including the term AF. Rochefort circled the 2 letters on the board and wrote in large print, AF equal sign. Everyone understood. This was the key to the entire Japanese plan. But the greater challenge came from within. In Washington, the Navy's Central Cryptographic Office, OP-20G, didn't trust Rochefort's methods. Officers in the capital insisted Hypo should only do basic analysis and let them handle final verification. But war waits for no one. Rochefort, furious but calm, replied, "If we wait for their approval, we might get an answer. After the war ends." Tensions rose. Washington ordered him to send all findings to D.C. Rochefort refused, choosing to stay on the front lines. He told Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, "If we're right, thousands will live. If we're wrong, I'll take the blame." And then, in the final days of April, that belief was rewarded. A long Japanese message was intercepted. After stripping away the additive layer, part of it emerged. Code groups meaning aircraft carrier, maneuver, amphibious support, and AF. For the first time, Hypo could confirm. A massive naval operation was underway. Maps were spread across the table. From Midway to the Aleutians, from Wake to Fiji, every possibility was considered. But Rochefort wasn't satisfied. He needed proof. Because if they guessed wrong, Nimitz would send America's 3 carriers to the wrong place, and the entire Pacific Fleet could be destroyed. Under crushing pressure, they kept working. Day and night. Without rest. Coffee, cigarettes, and belief were all that kept them going. Some began hallucinating from exhaustion. Finnegan recalled, "One time I stared at a number group and it started to move." But they never gave up. Because out there, the war raged on. And in the basement, they knew intelligence was America's last line of defense. Rochefort stood before the Pacific map, eyes sunken, voice hoarse from cigarettes. "If AF really is Midway, then we've only got a few weeks. They're coming, and we have to be there waiting." Silence filled the room. No one said a word. Only the IBM machines thudded steadily, like the heartbeat of a nation holding its breath. Late May 1942. Pearl Harbor still reeked of scorched steel, but in the basement of Station Hypo, another storm was brewing, a storm of numbers and doubt. For weeks, Japanese transmissions had repeatedly mentioned the code AF. Every plan, every movement pointed there. Rochefort believed AF was Midway, a small island in the Central Pacific, the last outpost before the U.S. itself would be at risk. But in Washington, his superiors disagreed. They thought it might be Alaska or Fiji. They demanded more proof, while time slipped away. If Rochefort was wrong, America's 3 carriers would be sent in the wrong direction. If he was right, this was the only chance to turn the tide of war. Amid the stalemate, a member of the team, Wilfred Holmes, came up with a bold idea. If they're mentioning AF that often, let's make them tell us what AF really is. The room fell silent. Holmes suggested having Midway send out an unencrypted message stating that the island's water purification system had broken, and they were running low on fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted it, they'd likely repeat the detail in their own transmission, and AF would be revealed. Rochefort heard him out and replied curtly, "Do it, before Washington shuts it down." That afternoon, the Midway station transmitted the false message. "Water distillation equipment damaged. Fresh water supply running low." It was sent openly, unencrypted, on frequencies the Japanese were certain to be monitoring. Then they waited. 1 day, 2 days. No response. On the 3rd day, a Japanese message was intercepted. When decrypted, Dyer shouted, They said AF is low on fresh water. The bunker erupted in cheers. They had won the intellectual gamble. AF was Midway. Rochefort circled the spot in red on the map. They're coming here, and we'll be waiting here. But to fight, they needed to know when. The answer came from the youngest team member, Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. After countless sleepless nights, he discovered that the Japanese were encoding dates and times using a separate additive table, not the usual JN25 method. Once reversed, the pattern became clear. Finnegan ran into the room, clutching his notes. They'll attack between June 4th and 5th. Rochefort stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Every piece had fallen into place. Location, Midway, time, early June, forces, 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. That night, Rochefort sat alone before the Pacific map, the weak yellow lamp casting shadows on his weary face. He knew he had just delivered to America the most valuable asset in war, knowledge of the future. On the morning of May 27th, Rochefort and intelligence officer Edwin Layton walked into Admiral Nimitz's briefing room. Across the table were telegrams, maps, and charts. Rochefort spoke slowly, each word deliberate. Admiral, they will strike at Midway, on June 4th or 5th, with the 4 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was silent for a long time, then said, I believe you. A short sentence, but enough to change history. With that trust, Nimitz immediately deployed America's remaining 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, setting sail toward a secret location called Point Luck, over 300 miles northeast of Midway. The counteroffensive had begun. In the bunker, Rochefort and his team continued working in silence, eyes fixed on every line of code printed by the IBM machines. None of them would see the battlefield, but they knew. When the explosions erupted at Midway, every bullet fired would carry traces of the mines down here, the ones who fought with intelligence. Dawn, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean was calm. In the skies northwest of Midway, low clouds drifted slowly, concealing beneath them the most powerful strike force Japan had deployed since Pearl Harbor. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. On deck, Japanese pilots tightened their harnesses. Engines roared in readiness. They believed Midway would be a complete surprise, that the Americans would never see it coming. But in the shadows, 350 miles away, 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were already in position, thanks to the mines in the basement of Station Hypo. As the sun rose, Midway's radar detected strange signals 90 miles out. Alarms blared across the base. American pilots scrambled into the air. Aging buffaloes and wildcats launched like desperate arrows into a storm of steel. 108 Japanese planes rained bombs on Midway, turning the base into a sea of fire, destroying hangars, fuel depots, and shredding the runway. But the base held. Amid the smoke and chaos, Midway's command tower sent a simple message: "We are still fighting." Far out at sea, U.S. PBY Catalina scout planes spotted the Japanese fleet. When the first report reached Nimitz, he said only, "Good, begin." Waves of American aircraft took off from Enterprise, Hornet, and then Yorktown. They flew for hours in silence, encountering no enemy. Many pilots ran low on fuel and had to turn back. Below deck, American officers watched the clock, calculating every minute. They knew the window would only open once. At 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane spotted the U.S. fleet to the northeast. The report stunned Nagumo. He immediately halted the second strike on Midway and ordered all aircraft rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The decks were packed with planes refueling, bombs stacked in corridors, fuel lines still connected. On those ships, confusion spread. And in that moment, destiny arrived. At 10:22 a.m., from 14,000 feet, 3 dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown suddenly descended. They had gotten lost, but by chance, or fate, spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer and followed it straight to the fleet. Below them, the 4 Japanese carriers were in their most vulnerable state. Fueled planes, exposed ordnance, crews midway through rearming. As the dauntless bombers dove, sunlight flashed off their wings like blades. In just 6 minutes, history turned. American bombs fell on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Akagi took 1 bomb through the deck, igniting fuel stores, a massive explosion. Kaga was engulfed in flames, its flight deck obliterated. Soryu took 3 direct hits and turned into a sea of fire. In an instant, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were reduced to infernos. Japanese pilots never got airborne. Firefighters were burned alive. Thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. Admiral Nagumo stood silently on the deck, staring at the western horizon where the smoke rose. He knew control had slipped from his grasp. Only Hiryu, the sole untouched carrier, launched a counterattack. 2 waves of aircraft struck Yorktown, crippling it and sending smoke pouring from its deck. But by afternoon, American planes found Hiryu and struck back. 4 armor-piercing bombs turned it into a fireball. By sunset, it too was burning and sinking, taking over 700 sailors with it. As the sun set that day, all 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed. Over 3,000 sailors and nearly all of Japan's elite pilots were lost. Aboard the USS Enterprise, a staff officer looked at the map and quietly said, "In 6 minutes, we changed the Pacific." The Battle of Midway was over, but its meaning stretched far beyond military victory. It proved that intellect could alter fate, that those working in the basement of Station Hypo contributed to triumph, not through firepower, but through understanding and resolve. When news of victory arrived, Rochefort remained silent. He didn't cheer, he didn't speak. He knew this win didn't belong solely to the men on deck, but also to those who stayed up through countless nights, decoding cold strings of numbers to uncover truths that saved thousands of lives. In his journal, he wrote just 1 line, "The job is done." After the victory at Midway, America rejoiced. The press hailed the pilots, the admirals, the heroic ships. But in the basement of Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort and his team fell into silence. They were not named. No honors. To Washington, they were merely technical personnel. But those who truly understood knew. Midway was won because of their intellect. Soon after, jealousy from superiors in Washington flared. The Redman brothers, naval intelligence officers, accused Rochefort of overstepping authority and not following protocol. They couldn't bear the idea that someone from a basement could report directly to Admiral Nimitz. In October 1942, Rochefort was reassigned from Station Hypo. The official reason? Rotation for field experience. But everyone knew. It was a sentence. From silent hero, he was exiled to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco, far from intelligence work. Nimitz was furious, but powerless. All he could do was write 1 line in a personal letter to Rochefort. "You saved the entire Pacific, history will know." But history stayed silent for too long. The Distinguished Service Medal Nimitz recommended for Rochefort was denied. The record stated coldly, "Insufficient evidence." Rochefort didn't protest. He simply continued working until he retired in 1953, living quietly in California, rarely speaking of Midway. He once said, "I only read what others tried to hide," then smiled. It wasn't until the mid-1970s, when classified documents were declassified, that the world learned the truth. The telegrams, the notes he had written by hand, matched perfectly with the Japanese plans. The victory at Midway, the miracle that changed the course of the Pacific War, began in that very bunker, where he once sat with a cold cup of coffee and sunken eyes. In 1986, 44 years after the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. He had passed away 10 years earlier. At the White House, his son accepted the honor on his behalf. When the citation was read aloud, he won not with weapons, but with intellect. The entire hall stood. America had finally remembered the name Joseph Rochefort, the man who read the enemy's mind and changed the course of the war. World War II ended, but the numbers, the punch cards, and the cramped basement in Pearl Harbor still echo through history. The Battle of Midway didn't just save America. It proved an eternal truth. The power of intellect can change the course of war. The men of Station Hypo didn't carry rifles, didn't wear medals, but every line of code they broke saved thousands of lives at sea. They proved that courage isn't found only on the battlefield, but also in dark rooms where people dare to trust their reasoning over the orders of their superiors. Joseph Rochefort didn't live to see America finally honor his name, but his legacy endures in every generation of intelligence officers that followed. From the aging IBM machines in Hawaii, American cryptography marched into the electronic age, paving the way for the National Security Agency, where Rochefort's philosophy is still echoed daily. To understand the enemy is the first step to victory. Those lessons weren't just meant for war. They apply in peace, that knowledge, cooperation, and integrity can protect a nation more enduringly than weapons. Today, as light shines into the old bunker-turned-museum, visitors still see a faded piece of paper on Rochefort's desk. Its ink blurred with time. The words read, "The job is done." It's not just the close of a mission. It's the declaration of an entire generation. They proved that victory doesn't always come with the sound of gunfire, but from quiet minds and unwavering seekers of truth. And over the Pacific Ocean today, where seagulls soar above the waters where 4 Japanese carriers sank beneath those waves, history still whispers the name of one man, Joseph Rochefort, the man who read the enemy's mind and rewrote the fate of the world with the power of human intellect.